Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a stubborn neighbor encroaches on George Carter's cherished farmland, building a greenhouse without permission, it sets off a fierce battle for justice. This tale of resilience and determination shows how one man stood his ground to protect his family's legacy and the land they hold dear. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings that made me grateful to be alive and working the land passed down through 3 generations of my family. I sat on the front porch of my farmhouse, the steam rising from my mug of coffee as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the fields. It was my sacred ritual, a moment of quiet before the day's work began. Everything about the scene was familiar, from the rustle of dry leaves caught in the light breeze to the golden hues of the fallow field in the distance, or so I thought. As I took another sip, my eyes caught something that didn't belong. Out on the eastern edge of my property, where nothing but wild grass and stray saplings should have been, a structure shimmered in the early sunlight. At first, I squinted, thinking perhaps the light was playing tricks on me. But as I focused, it became clear. This was no illusion. A large, translucent structure glinted against the natural tones of the landscape, standing starkly where it had no business being. "What in the world?" I muttered, lowering my mug to get a better look. The realization hit me like a jolt of cold wind. That thing wasn't there yesterday. I'd walked that part of the field not 2 days ago, double-checking the fencing and clearing out some debris. My land was as familiar to me as the lines on my palms, and this was unmistakably out of place. I stood up, my chair scraping the wooden porch with a creak. My boots thudded heavily as I stepped to the edge of the porch, leaning forward as if it would bring clarity to what I was seeing. The structure seemed large, its reflective panels catching the morning light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. My mind raced. Who would put something like that there? And, more importantly, how? The field was far from the road, secluded enough that any activity there would have been immediately obvious. Or so I thought. Setting down my coffee, I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was temporary, some kind of shelter for wildlife research, or even something a passerby had put up overnight. But no. This wasn't some ramshackle contraption. The edges looked clean, the material expensive, almost professional. My stomach twisted with unease. This wasn't a random accident. Someone had planned this. The longer I stared, the angrier I got. My land wasn't just property to me. It was my legacy, a part of my family's history, and the thought of someone encroaching on it without so much as a word was enough to set my blood boiling. Whoever did this wasn't just trespassing. They were disrespecting the years of hard work and sacrifice that went into keeping this farm alive. I grabbed my coat and hat, my boots kicking up dust as I made my way to the truck. I had to know what this was and who was behind it. One thing was certain, this wasn't going to be an ordinary morning on the farm. Leaving my coffee mug behind, I grabbed my keys and climbed into my old Ford pickup. The engine roared to life with its usual grumble, and I guided it onto the dirt path that cut through my property. As the truck bumped along, my thoughts raced. Whoever put that structure out there must have known it wasn't theirs to build. I couldn't fathom the audacity or the nerve of someone just planting something on my land like they own the place. As I got closer, the structure loomed larger, its details becoming clearer. This wasn't some makeshift tarp tent or rickety shelter. It was a full-fledged greenhouse, and a professional one at that. The metal frame gleamed in the sunlight, sturdy and carefully constructed. Panels of thick polycarbonate reflected the surroundings, their pristine surface marred only by a thin layer of early morning dew. From the corners, I could see tubes snaking out, a clear sign of an irrigation system. Someone had put serious money and effort into this. I parked the truck a few yards away and stepped out, the dry grass crunching beneath my boots. The air around the structure smelled faintly of fertilizer, rich and earthy, mingling with something sharper that I couldn't quite place. I crouched down near the edge, running my hand over the freshly turned soil. This wasn't just a patch of land someone had slapped together on a whim. The ground had been tilled with care, the rows evenly spaced. Whoever was working here had plans, big ones. Stepping closer, I noticed a glint of light coming from one corner of the greenhouse. Wires, electrical wires threaded through small conduits along the frame. My stomach sank as I realized the implications. This wasn't some hobbyist's weekend project. The scale and sophistication of the setup hinted at something far more serious and possibly illegal. Then I saw it, a narrow trail leading away from the greenhouse and cutting through the brush. The faint tire tracks and crushed grass pointed unmistakably toward my neighbor's property. Of course, Randall Miller, or Randy as he insisted on being called, had moved in about a year ago from Los Angeles. Ever since, he'd been a thorn in my side. Loud parties, trash blowing over onto my fields, and constant complaints about the racket my tractor made. As if I was supposed to plow in silence. But this was on a whole different level. My fists clenched as I stared down the path, my mind already picturing Randy's smug face. What was he thinking? Building something like this on my land? Did he think I wouldn't notice? Did he even care? I stood there for a moment, the anger bubbling under my skin. The greenhouse, with its clean lines and shining surfaces, felt like an insult, a blatant disregard for the years my family and I had poured into this land. But more than that, it was a challenge, and I wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Turning back to my truck, I resolved to get to the bottom of this, and fast. I drove straight to Randy's place, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than they should. The dirt road leading to his property was uneven, jostling me and matching the tumult in my chest. By the time I pulled into his driveway, the anger was practically radiating off me. There he was, lounging on his deck like he didn't have a care in the world, a brightly colored cocktail in one hand and a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on his smug face. "Randy," I called out, hopping out of the truck and slamming the door behind me. My voice was louder than I'd intended, but I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "What the hell are you doing? Is that greenhouse yours?" He glanced up lazily, taking a deliberate sip of his drink before breaking into a grin. "Ah, George. Good to see you, neighbor," he drawled, as if we were old friends. "Yeah, that's mine. Pretty impressive, right? Decided to grow something a little different, bring a touch of California innovation to these parts. You should be proud." I stared at him, incredulous. Proud? Proud that you built a greenhouse on my land without even asking. You've got some nerve, Randy. My voice was sharper now, carrying the frustration that had been boiling since I first saw that structure. Randy's grin didn't waver. "Relax, George. That part of your field was just sitting there doing nothing. I figured I'd make some good use of it. You know, in California, we're all about sustainability and smart land use." My patience snapped. "Smart land use? That's my property. You had no right to put anything there, let alone a greenhouse for whatever it is you're growing. Take it down, now." He waved a hand dismissively like I was being unreasonable. "Oh, come on. You're overreacting. It's not hurting anything. And who knows, maybe it'll even add value to your farm. You should be thanking me." My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Randy, I'm serious. Either you get rid of that greenhouse or I'll take this to court." For the first time, his expression flickered, but the smirk quickly returned. "Court, really, George? You think your small-town lawyer can handle my team? I've got friends in high places, connections that could bury you in legal fees before you even get started. So go ahead, try me." His arrogance was infuriating, but I'd expected nothing less. Without another word, I turned and headed back to my truck. As I climbed in, I heard him call out behind me, "Lighten up, George. You'll thank me later. Maybe I'll even let you use it for some of your corn or whatever." I ignored him, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If Randy thought he could just steamroll over me and my family's legacy, he was sorely mistaken. The fight was just beginning. The moment I got back home, I grabbed my phone and called Emma Harris, an old friend and a lawyer based in Charlotte. Emma had a reputation for being sharp and relentless when it came to defending her clients, and I knew she was exactly the person I needed on my side. "Emma, I've got a situation," I began, pacing my kitchen as I explained what had happened. Her silence on the other end was unnerving at first, but then she spoke, her tone firm and decisive. "George, this is a clear violation of your property rights. He's not just trespassing, he's blatantly disregarding the law. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'll draft a cease and desist letter demanding he remove the greenhouse immediately. In the meantime, I suggest you contact the local zoning office. If he didn't file the proper permits, which I highly doubt he did, they can intervene as well." Her confidence bolstered my resolve. Over the next few days, I worked with Emma to finalize the letter, and I contacted the zoning board as she'd advised. Sure enough, Their investigation revealed that Randy hadn't filed any permits for the structure. To make matters worse, or perhaps better for my case, they suspected the greenhouse was being used to grow illegal substances. That revelation turned my frustration into determination. Not only had Randy encroached on my land, but he was using it for something potentially criminal. With Emma's guidance and the zoning board's findings, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. The wheels of justice were slow, but at least they were starting to turn in my favor. Randy's arrogance seemed to know no bounds. Days passed, and not only did he ignore the cease and desist letter and the zoning board's warning, but he doubled down on his defiance. Every morning, as I stepped onto my porch, the greenhouse stood there like a taunt, its lights blazing through the early mist. That faint, unmistakable smell lingered in the air, confirming my worst suspicions about what he was growing. It made my blood boil, not just because he was trespassing, but because he acted like the law didn't apply to him. I decided to confront him one more time, though I knew it would likely lead nowhere. Driving over to his property, I rehearsed my points in my head, determined to stay calm. But the moment I saw him lounging by his deck, grinning like he owned the whole county, my composure wavered. "Randy," I said, stepping out of the truck, "we need to talk." He didn't even bother standing up. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a glass of something colorful in his hand, and smirked. "What's there to talk about, George? I thought we already settled this." "Settled? You're trespassing on my land, and now you're ignoring legal orders to stop. This isn't a game, Randy. You're breaking the law." He let out a dry laugh, swirling the ice in his glass. "Law? George, let's be honest. Do you really think you can win this? I've got money, lawyers, and connections. You've got... what? A letter from some zoning office?" His words were like a slap in the face, but I held my ground. "Keep laughing, Randy. You're only making things worse for yourself. This is far from over." He shrugged, his smug grin never faltering. "Suit yourself, old man. But if you ask me, you're wasting your time." I walked away, every step heavy with frustration and determination. Randy might have had money and connections, but what he didn't have was the right to my land. If he thought I'd roll over and let him win, he had another thing coming. This fight was just getting started. The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most stressful I'd ever endured. Emma was meticulous in preparing the case, and I spent countless evenings going over every detail with her. We compiled everything: photos of the greenhouse, property maps clearly showing the boundaries, and official zoning reports that confirmed Randy had built the structure without any permits. By the time we were ready, the evidence felt ironclad, but that didn't make walking into the courthouse any less daunting. On the morning of the trial, I woke early, unable to shake the nerves. As I drove into town, passing fields that had been in my family for generations, I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just about the land, it was about standing up for what was right. When I arrived at the courthouse, Emma met me at the steps, her sharp suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to my worn boots and calloused hands. She gave me a reassuring nod. "We've got this, George," she said. I wished I could feel as sure as she sounded. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, but the tension in the air made it feel enormous. Randy was already there, flanked by his high-priced legal team. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck, and his smirk was as infuriating as ever. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the judge, a stern-looking woman with steel gray hair and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. She called the court to order, and just like that, the battle began. Emma started by laying out the facts clearly and methodically. She presented the photos of the greenhouse, the property documents, and the zoning board's findings. When she called me to the stand, I did my best to stay calm, recounting everything from the moment I discovered the structure to my attempts to resolve the issue amicably. Randy's lawyer tried to trip me up, suggesting I'd verbally given Randy permission to use the land. But I stood firm, sticking to the truth. When it was Randy's turn, his lawyers painted a very different picture. They claimed the greenhouse was a simple mistake, a misunderstanding of property lines. Randy himself took the stand, playing the role of the apologetic neighbor who only wanted to improve the community. He even claimed that tearing down the greenhouse would cause him undue hardship given the money he'd invested in it. I couldn't believe the audacity. This wasn't a mistake. It was calculated. And the idea that Randy, with his flashy cars and endless resources, could claim hardship was almost laughable. The judge didn't seem particularly moved by his performance, often interrupting his testimony with pointed questions he struggled to answer. After hours of arguments and cross-examinations, the moment of truth finally arrived. The judge took a deep breath, her expression unreadable, and began to deliver her verdict. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, she said, her voice steady and authoritative, "I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. George Carter." Relief washed over me like a wave, but the judge wasn't finished. Turning her gaze to Randy, she continued, "The defendant's actions represent a blatant disregard for property rights and zoning laws. The court orders the immediate removal of the greenhouse within 30 days. Additionally, the defendant will compensate the plaintiff for damages, cover all legal fees, and pay a fine for zoning violations." Randy's smirk was gone, replaced by a sullen glare as he leaned over to whisper furiously to his lawyer, but it didn't matter. The decision was final. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Emma patted me on the back, grinning. "We did it, George. Justice served." I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think about the future, a future where my land was mine again, untouched and free from Randy's arrogance. It had been a long fight, but standing there on those courthouse steps, I knew it had been worth every moment. The demolition crew arrived exactly 30 days after the court's decision. As ordered, I stood at the edge of my property, watching as the greenhouse that had caused me so much stress was finally being taken apart. It was oddly satisfying to see the structure come down piece by piece, the clean panels and metal frame reduced to nothing more than debris. I stayed there the entire day, making sure everything went as planned. This was my land, and I wasn't about to let anyone cut corners in restoring it. Randy was there too, of course, standing on his side of the property line with his arms crossed. His face was a mask of anger, the smugness he'd carried all these months replaced by a quiet, simmering rage. He didn't say a word to me, and I didn't bother speaking to him either. What was there to say? He'd lost, and we both knew it. When the last of the debris was loaded onto a truck and driven away, I stepped onto the bare patch of earth where the greenhouse had stood. The soil was compacted and scarred, but it was mine again. I crouched down, running my fingers through the dirt, feeling a sense of relief I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. This land had been through enough, and now it was time to heal. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly to restore the area. I tilled the soil, breaking up the compacted ground and mixing in fresh fertilizer. I planted cover crops to replenish the nutrients and bring life back to the damaged section of the field. It was hard work, but it felt good, like I was reclaiming something that had been stolen. Randy kept his distance after that. The loud parties stopped, the ATVs disappeared, and the barking dogs were nowhere to be heard. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a kind of peace I could live with. The tension between us remained, unspoken but understood. He'd learned his lesson, and I doubted he'd try anything like this again. As the weeks turned into months, the field began to recover. By summer, the once damaged soil was alive with green shoots, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time I walked past it. This land was more than just property. It was a legacy, a part of my family's story, and now it was mine again, whole and untouched. Standing there one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, I felt a deep sense of closure. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it was worth it. This land and everything it represented had been defended. And as I headed back to the farmhouse, I knew one thing for certain: no one would ever take it from me again. By the time spring rolled around, the patch of earth where the greenhouse had once stood was alive again. Rows of young corn shoots stretched toward the sky, their vibrant green a stark contrast to the barren soil I'd stared at just months earlier. Seeing that growth, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The battle had been grueling, but standing there now, I knew it had all been worth it. This land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was my family's story, a legacy that I had fought to protect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the fields, I found myself lingering a little longer by that section of the farm. I ran my hand over the sturdy stalks of corn, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It felt like the land was speaking back to me, thanking me for standing my ground. "This land is our history," I murmured to myself, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "And it's our future. No one, not even the craftiest neighbor, will ever take that away from us again." I turned to face the farmhouse, its familiar silhouette outlined against the fading light. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of true peace. The long fight had taught me more than I ever expected, about resilience, about justice, and about the strength that comes from knowing what you stand for. The support of my community, Emma's unyielding dedication, and my own determination had all come together to prove a point. No matter how tough the odds, standing up for what's right is always the right choice. The story of the greenhouse became a lesson for the entire county. Neighbors I'd hardly spoken to before started to stop by, sharing their own tales of struggle and triumph. My farm became more than just a piece of land. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when you refuse to back down. As I headed back to the house, the sky now painted in soft purples and blues, I couldn't help but smile. This land was ours, always had been, always would be. And as long as I was around, I'd make sure it stayed that way.